Yeah. All right. So hi everyone and welcome to session 3 of Debating 101, which is a program by the Debaters Council to gain accessible international level coaching and advice to the local circuit. And the point of this is that you'll find workshops online covering maybe similar content or covering similar ideas. But what this gives you is one, the chance to sort of see it on your own in person. And two, we have Q&A sessions and a much more interactive format in which you're able to interact with the speaker and ask questions in a way that you might not be able to interact with if the content's online and pre-recorded. So for your sake and for the speaker, it would be really amazing if you could turn cameras on, or if not that, interact with the speaker in chat in terms of if there's exercises, and just give your cooperation for you to get the most of it and for the session to be the best for everyone as well. So today's speaker is Sophia Zuo from Team Taiwan. So Sophia is an incredibly stellar speaker. Sophia captained Team Taiwan quite recently, semi-finalist at Oxford WSDC. Currently, Sophia is a debater at Princeton. And in addition to that, a bunch of stellar achievements on the university circuit, finalist at Harthouse IV, and a bunch of others that I probably won't mention because that'll take quite a bit of time. But I think one other big notable one is first breaking team at the Johns Hopkins University Novice tournaments, which again, very competitive tournament. So Sophia's workshop today is going to be on second speaker strategy. Big focus on weighing metrics, but Sophia has been an incredibly good speaker, second speaker for Team Taiwan. So feel free to ask any questions you might have about the role in general. So Sophia will give you a lot of advice that focus on weighing, but feel free to go beyond that if your interest lies there as well. And I believe she'll answer the best she can, which will be very good. That being said, I hand it over to Sophia. Great having you. And again, thank you so much from the DC and from me.
Okay, thanks, Janel, for that very kind introduction. Yeah, so before I really jump into any of the content, I just want to reiterate a few things going forward. One is that you can ask me any questions if anything confuses you. I know that the lecture was kind of marketed as something that both novices and advanced to intermediate debaters could enjoy. So if you have any questions about, deeper level things, or maybe you do not get certain concepts, feel free to just text me or ask a question out loud. It really is very chill like that. And secondly, it's also that, okay, I do know that this is a lecture on weighing metrics specifically, but if you do have questions about second speaker writ large, about what are some tips you would like to hear about being a second speaker, difficulties, things that you yourself are struggling with, do not hesitate to also just reach out, text, or ask. All right, cool. So after this introduction, I just want to formally introduce the topic of today's lecture. As you can see on the screen, it is about weighing metrics as a second speaker. So I will be talking about, weighing as a whole, but also just discussing.
Sophia, hold on a second. I think we can't see your screen. It's shared initially, but apparently some people. Oh, I think I see it now.
Paused it. Okay, I resumed it. Can you see it?
I see it. Can everyone else see it as well? Could we just get thumbs ups in the chat if people can see it? Okay, Druin, I see his thumbs up. Seneca. All right, great. Thank you so much. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Yeah, so as you can see from the screen now, we are discussing weighing metrics as a second speaker. Let's jump in. So firstly, a quick agenda for what exactly we're going to be talking about and covering today. Firstly, is just a brief introduction about what exactly weighing metrics are and why they are important in debate. Secondly, discussing different weighing metrics that you can use within a debate and their different utility and their uses for different motions. Thirdly, discussing round vision and strategy as a second speaker, when exactly to deploy weighing, because we know that as a second speaker, there are a lot of things that you have to balance. And then fourthly, discussing, how exactly can we develop skill as, someone who uses weighing metrics, and also just giving further readings and media examples. That's a very brief slide. And lastly, if we want dedicated time towards Q&A, just write down your questions and we can have a brief session of just questions at the end. All right, So first things first, what exactly is weighing? I think it was something, or for me as a debater that started out, weighing was something that deeply confused me because I think until that point, debate was mostly about proving that the other side was wrong, that just disproving their mechanisms, that saying like whatever that they said was not true, and just like all of their claims were bogus and things like that. But I think once I started to develop as a debater, I realized that that weighing is very, very intrinsic to debate. And it's not exactly about proving people wrong, but rather saying that even if they are right, why our arguments still take precedent in this debate and why we should still win the round. So at its very core, weighing is a comparison between claims, such as proving that claim A is greater than or more important than claim B, or by proving that claim X, Y, and Z is equivalent in value to A, B, and C, etc. So it's basically just drawing comparisons and equations, I would say, between different claims from your side and the opposition side. I think weighing comes in handy, especially when debates are tight on other fronts, such as argument mechanism, which is to say that the other side does a really good job of proving their own arguments. They have very robust mechanisms that are very hard to break down and break through. Weighing can help judges conceptualize how exactly you can still win despite losing on some of the other arguments by still like letting some of opposition arguments fly and having them stand at the end of the round. I think a good mentality to approach weighing is that you simply cannot disprove everything that the other side is going to say. You either will not have enough time, given the very limited time that you have for 7 or 8 minutes, or whatever limit you have, or the arguments that they push forward are just simply really, really well built and well crafted. You cannot really disprove them given the amount of time and resources that you have. So given that you can't disprove everything, you rather can compare everything and draw, comparisons, trade-offs, weigh the round and say why, okay, even if they are right, why we still can win. So as someone who is judged here and there, I would say from a judge's point of view, weighing is extremely helpful. It helps with lower quality round. It helps quality rounds actually exist because we think that as a judge, lacking detailed weighing or lacking weighing at all leaves a lot of room for the judges themselves to intervene or step in or even get detached, which is not good. For example, if both teams have very, very differing claims, with one arguing for the benefit of, let's say, economic development versus another arguing for environmentalist benefits. And it's like a debate about, I guess, decarbonizing or putting carbon tax on the industry. As a judge, there are two equally, let's say, well-proven arguments or somewhat equally well-proven arguments about, climate change and why we actually get better environmentalist movement success, and another claim about how we actually get more economic development. As a judge, if there is no weighing in the round, it is up to me to choose which one I deem more important. But the issue with that is that can fall back on, judges' own biases, their own preconceived notions, and their own personal opinions, which oftentimes can fluctuate depending on the judge that you get. So just to reduce the chance that, the judge doesn't like your argument and they don't really care about, let's say, economic development, it is very, very important to do weighing to prove why one of your benefits is still better than their benefit. All right, so weighing continued. I think the three main types of weighing that I've experienced as a debater so far are firstly, argument likelihood, secondly, argument consequence and impact, and thirdly, on-round dynamics. And one thing to note, I'll explain these three types of weighing in more detail later on. But one thing to note is that weighing can occur both when teams are trying to access the same benefit or when they are claiming two completely different ones. So for example, using the example that I just gave about carbon tax, another team can also claim to decarbonize the economy and achieve net zero emissions. And that can be the same impact that both sides are trying to achieve. However, the difference that you can weigh upon is the way that they achieve these things to begin with, like longevity, who is hurt in the process, stakeholder analysis. There are different things that you can weigh upon depending on whether or not you're trying to access the same benefit or claim two completely different ones. And I'll elaborate on that later on as well. I'd also just like to say that as a second speaker in Asian parliamentary or world schools debate, you will typically focus on likelihood and impact weighing. just because in British parliamentary is probably where you get the most round dynamics by nature of having 4 completely different teams with like their own cases, their own lines to run. It is much more likely that you can actually do round dynamic weighing there than actually in Asian parliamentary. So that brings me to like, I guess, the core of weighing metrics and what I think should be the biggest takeaway for all debaters alike at the end of this lecture is that in order to weigh successfully, you need to do 2 things well. Firstly is just to prove that your argument fits inside your metric. That is to say that you can measure your argument in a way that fits inside the metric that you want to measure it in. So let's say, if my argument is that we will decrease carbon emissions, the metric that you can use is, okay, solving climate change, or to be even more specific, decreasing carbon emissions. Like oftentimes the metrics are very, very in line with your own argument. So you need to prove that your argument can actually fit inside the metric. But the second thing, and I argue is also probably more important, or probably things that debaters forget to do more, is to prove that using your metric is correct. That is to say that in this debate, why exactly should the judge follow your metric as opposed to the ones that the opposition gives as well? So if the metric is, let's say, okay, a utilitarian metric, how many civilian lives do you protect? Why exactly is that the metric that we should use to judge this debate? And why is it the most important consideration? Those are things that you need to do a good job upon and actually dedicate some time and detailed thought and analysis on in the round to really push forward your metric and make sure that it's being internalized by the judge and actually has use. All right, so last thing about just describing weighing metrics, to really hone it in your head. I just searched up metric on Google and I found this definition, a system or a standard of measurement. I think that's pretty straightforward as to what exactly it is, right? There are specific ways of measuring a claim's importance and worth in the round. And there are plenty of different ways to measure an argument that can inflate or deflate your argument or your point's importance. So one example that I thought of while creating this lecture is thinking about like rapper beef. If you've heard of like the Kendrick or Drake, I guess, beef recently, or Nicki Minaj or Megan Thee Stallion or Tupac and like Biggie, there's so much rapper beef. And everybody's just arguing, okay, who's the better rapper? I think a lot of people, fall back on a few metrics about how exactly they can define this and how they can determine that. And so a few things are like lyricism, flow, charisma, popularity. These are all different metrics that you can judge a rapper on. And depending on which metric you want to push forward, depending on which rapper you want to defend, you can choose one metric and really hone in on why that metric should be the one that proves that, oh, Kendrick is the better rapper. So to really extend this example, let's say, okay, I want to prove that Kendrick is the better rapper as opposed to Drake. And I choose lyricism. And I can just say that, okay, we should judge lyricism as the best metric because 1, it's actually hard. It's very hard to think of lyrics. A lot of rappers have their own ghostwriters. 2, Kendrick lyrics are very, very socially aware, like social activism, as opposed to like whatever Drake raps about. Thank you. Yeah, so continuing on, I would say that okay, firstly, you need to prove that Kendrick actually has better lyrics. Secondly, prove that lyricism is like the most important metric. That's just a good comparison to kind of get your mind going in the right direction of how to weigh. And ideally, the metrics that you choose inflate your side and deflate oppositions. They shouldn't be metrics that both sides do quite well on. So for example, popularity. Both Kendrick and Drake are very popular. You're not really going to win if you choose that metric. Choose one that there's a sizable difference in. All right. Moving on. So I'm gonna go through a list of weighing metrics. This is this is inexhaustive, and I would say there are tons of other ways that you can weigh arguments, but these are probably the biggest ones that you need to take note of and the ones that crop up the most during round. The first thing is just argument likelihood, which I discussed earlier. I think as a second speaker, you are trying to argue or you're trying to do most of the debate or most of your speech on argument likelihood. That is to say, proving why the other side's arguments are just less likely to manifest, disproving their mechanisms, breaking those down. You can argue or weigh upon likelihood by saying, okay, if their arguments are just less likely to happen and ours are more likely, we can better access our benefits, whereas their benefits are probably more likely to be like, okay, watered down, inconsequential, and I guess marginal. So that is one way that you can weigh your round or weigh the debate. The second thing is on uniqueness. So how accessible is your or their benefit? And how exactly like can you replicate it? I would say in motions that discuss reparations, it's very important to touch upon uniqueness and saying, okay, is there any other way that we can benefit, indigenous or previously marginalized or oppressed populations in a way that is suitable or a way that is fitting versus like, okay, cash handouts or government subsidy programs versus other things like directly giving them back indigenous or native land. Talking about uniqueness of this and explaining why one way is much more unique or one way is much more special can really help extend your case and differentiate it from the other side. Thirdly, it's talking about scope and magnitude, or in other words, gravity. So I think this is probably one of the most common ways to weigh an argument, which is just by the numbers game and describing how many people are affected, how many people are deeply affected, not to really use the same example over and over again, but thinking about the claim of nuclear war, or let's say like something immensely harmful that could be caused by, like you want to claim as an impact. Nuclear war might not be very probable, but if it does happen, the whole world might be gone. So you can talk about, okay, the scope is too large to risk and weigh on that metric versus if you want to talk about how deeply people are affected, it could be one person and like in a hypothetical thought experiment, they are subjected to eternal slavery. That would also not be cool. So I think there are definitely different ways that you can weigh your metric or like use different metrics depending on your own case that you want to put forward. Moving on. Another thing that you can weigh on is timeline. So for example, if there is interim harm, so if you are trying to access a claim or like a benefit at the end, are there like trade-offs in between? Will we have to sacrifice, I don't know, thousands of lives before we can achieve the benefit that you want to claim? So I guess one motion to use as an example is like this house would pursue a rebellion. And in the meantime, or in the interim of pursuing that rebellion, that can probably lead to thousands of deaths. And you can weigh upon whether or not that is, justified, if that is worthy of the consequences or the benefits that a rebellion will bring about. Secondly, within the timeline weighing metric is long or short term. So discussing whether the effects of your case have longevity or if they're more short term and instant. That can also be a good way of differentiating your side with the other team. And then also upon compounding benefits or harms. So that is just to say like, okay, does this benefit get better over time? Do we accumulate or compound more benefits over time? Or vice versa, like does the opposition incur more harms over time, and how exactly does that factor in to the debate as a whole? Fifthly, on principle, I know that Treyar talked about principle in his own lecture, so I'm sure you guys have a better grasp of how exactly they come about and their importance. But things like autonomy, self-defense, free speech, and ownership can all be ways to measure whether or not something is worth pursuing or whether something is important in the round. So you can say, all right, on their side, they might get a better economy, but they take away freedom of speech or they take away autonomy, and people are subjected to inhumane hours of work and servitude. They lose on that metric. So these are all ways that you can, I guess, utilize a principle. Lastly, and I think also very importantly, you can weigh upon the vulnerability of an actor. So discussing why exactly is one stakeholder much more important. Let's say, okay, if you're weighing an argument that discusses, okay, we benefit the poorest of the poor, like maybe those living in abject poverty versus on their side, they might uplift everybody in society by, 1 or 2% versus we uplift the 1 and 2% of society by 50%. I think it's much, much more reasonable for the judge to care about the poorest of the poor, those in abject poverty, versus, I guess, the rest of society who's already living in generally better conditions and who, if they improve their living conditions by 1 or 2%, will not make that substantial of a difference as well. Another example of vulnerability of actors is like in criminal justice system motions, talking about victim reparation and like, why should we care about what the victim feels above general society? Because the victim is the one that, like, you know, actually got hurt. They're the ones who are directly violated. Their lives were changed and they're like inextricably altered. And that's exactly why we have the obligation to listen to the victims first and foremost above anybody else. You know, those are just examples of how you can use that metric. All right, further aspects to consider in the debate. This is a bit higher level, so I would say don't get too stressed if you don't really internalize this off the bat. But one thing is just to know that when you're weighing arguments, is to keep in mind realism. So is the argument more realistic because of specific characterizations made about the elements of the round involved? So that is to say, oftentimes when you're debating, you get lost in a lot of mechanisms, a lot of fancy debate talk and lingo, I would say. It's important to really snap out of the debate world sometimes and really tell the judge which one is more realistic. I guess this ties back to argument likelihood, because the more realistic an argument is, the more likely it is. But that is just one metric that you can really push and be aware of during the round. Like, is this actually going to happen? Is this how the real world like actually works? Secondly, talking about responsibility of stakeholder. Is this inherent to a specific actor the motion specifies, and making sure that the right actor is involved in the motion? Before I move on, are there any questions?
No.
Okay, thank you for responding. Yeah, if you have any questions, please type them or just say them out loud. But moving on, I just want to talk about weighing through round dynamics for those of you guys who are interested in BP or have that like curiosity. I would say that weighing through round dynamics, this is also credits to Miko, who I watched a really good YouTube video on weighing as well. And he said that it's basically two things that you can take into account. One is responsiveness. So does the argument implicitly or explicitly respond to other claims being made in the round, which is very strategic. I would say, like, okay, if we have this argument and inherently or like literally preempts or explicitly responds to other arguments that are given by other teams, how can we actually factor this into this debate? What does this mean for like the round as a whole? You can say that if we prove this argument, the way that you weigh this in the round is that all of the other claims made by the opposition teams cannot stand or they're less important just because it disproves a lot of their argumentation already, or like it co-ops their impacts or other benefits. The second thing that you can discuss where like you're weighing through round dynamics is independence. So is the claim being made independent of other claims in the round being true, or is it dependent on other arguments that are inherently or essentially in a deadlock? So this is to say, I think a lot of the times in rounds, debaters will go back and forth, and there really is no one conclusion that can be, I guess, considerably reached or very conclusively reached, because both debaters are doing either a really good or a really poor job, and the judge cannot really choose. I think one way that you can break this deadlock is by introducing another argument or another claim independent of anything that's already being said, or independent of the deadlock, and explain why, even if there is a deadlock, this one claim breaks that because we have X benefit, we have X thing that they haven't accounted for, and that is the most important thing going forward in that round. Okay, now into like a deep dive into why exactly we weigh and what is the importance of weighing as a second speaker. I think the first thing to note is that we just want to make sure our arguments are still continuously relevant to the debate. I think a lot of the times when you have a good first speaker, and oftentimes like they burn through a lot of material, a lot of claims, and they have a few different impacts. As a second speaker, you want to make sure that the impacts that are most important, most, I guess, capable of winning you the round are continuously relevant to the debate. And that means you're going to bring them back and weigh them over what's already being said by the opposition. If you do not weigh your points and you continuously like, I guess, push the same impact without trying to like draw comparisons, it leads the judge either like not really believing you or trying to, or lacking, I guess, a good grasp about why the argument still matters, even if it does have a really, really good impact. And that leads me to my second point, which is that it is comparative to the opponent. I think as a second speaker, our jobs are to be very, very responsive and very, very like I guess, flexible to whatever the second or whatever the opposition says before you. And this means that when you're trying to weigh your argumentation with the opposition, it is supposed to be comparative to the opponent. It's supposed to make sure that, okay, we recognize what the opposition has said, and we still think that we win for X, Y, and Z reasons, even if they are proving their point sufficiently. And lastly, and I think very, very importantly, it is to adapt to round dynamics and to introduce new points. I think a lot of the times, as a second speaker, there is the constant struggle of like, okay, do we actually run an extension or not? I think a lot of the times, the second speaker dilemma is if the extension is really important and round winning, just run it in first. But you kind of want like a mid argument, but not so mid that it doesn't really matter, but enough that like if it matters, your third could kind of pivot on it and like have a path to victory. I would say sometimes an extension in second speaker can be just a new weighing metric, can be a new way of looking at the debate. And I would say when you're adapting to round dynamics and introducing new points, weighing is a really, really, really good way to give the judge a lens into what you strategically want to push and what new points you're making that the opposition has to respond to. So what I mean by this is that when you're trying to introduce a new weighing metric, this narrows the debate down and forces the opposition into a pathway that they must, I guess, follow or even just acknowledge. So for example, if you want to weigh on the metric of utilitarianism, who benefits the most lives? If you spend a good amount of time in your second speech explaining why this is the most important metric, the opposition has to respond to that. So they cannot just like leave it standing there, leave it floating there, or else I think it looks really bad for them. You're probably going to win because the judge is convinced by that metric. They either have to give a competing metric and explain why that metric is more relevant, or they have to win on your own grounds by explaining why they also fulfill the utilitarian metric. And that really helps narrow the debate down and force opposition and pressure them into, I guess, a trajectory of the debate that you want it to go into. So when done well, I think weighing is a very, very good way of exerting pressure on your opponent and narrowing down the debate into a few specific clashes and questions, which is what you want to do as a second speaker. All right, so continuing on, I think seconds also make a lot of strategic calls on round direction and strategy through weighing. So like I said before, if you collapse on your second argument, which prioritizes X impact, you can force opposition to win on X grounds or respond to X claims more thoroughly. So just a way for you to like, I guess, as a second speaker, what are we winning on right now? What are we losing on right now? How can I patch the distinction between these two and still make sure that even if we are losing on some grounds, we have a clear path to victory and we can win on very, very specific metrics and really, really driving that into the judge's head. I think another, I guess, benefit of weighing as a second is to give whip speaker directions or foundations for more complex weighing. So for example, if the round has a very, very clear trade-off or a very, very clear clash of like, let's say it's like social movements, and one of the arguments is accessibility versus, I guess, quality of the movement, which is, okay, one side has 1,000 more people that will join versus one side has a lot clearer direction, has a lot clearer agenda and internal organization. In that case, as a second speaker, can weigh very clearly between the two. And obviously you're going to get pushback from the opposition, the next speaker from opposition. I think if you already lay down a very, very stable foundation for the whip speaker and like give the very, very basic premises of why we win on this metric or why this metric is more important than the other one, your whip speaker can do a lot more responsive and complex weighing that can help sway the judge because you already lay the foundations down. So this just allows for more in-depth debate, which is why you want to get to it earlier as a second, especially if the weighing metrics are clear and beneficial for you. I think just another good way of understanding weighing as a second speaker is that it's like a defense mechanism. You can compare worst cases. This is like another common move that second speakers do, which is like comparing worst cases against best case scenario by saying that, okay, even in our worst case, which is what the opposition will likely push upon you, which is that like your mechanisms are faulty, the impacts are more diluted. Even in that worst case, why you still weigh or win over the opposition's best case scenario and do internal weighing there. And you can also do comparison against arguments that you lose upon, like I said before, why even if you lose on their grounds, why you still win the debate overall. I think ultimately, weighing lends you a lot of credibility because it tells the judge that you are aware of what's going on during the round and what points are being made by both sides and the merits to both of them. I think a good way of thinking about weighing is that it is a bottom line. It's like adding a period to the end of your argumentation by saying that even if they have these benefits, why we still can win on these grounds, why we still should win this debate as well. I also think another underrated benefit of weighing is that it can also be a time saver. That is to say that you can circumvent doing a lot of mechanistic rebuttal, although ideally you would do both as a second speaker, but you can also like ignore a lot of rebuttal mechanistically by just saying that it doesn't matter if they prove this point because it's just simply less important in this round. And that's another way that you can save time as a second speaker. All right, so now on to common questions or I guess issues that people face when they're trying to use weighing metrics in their round. These questions include, okay, like how do I actually choose a metric to use? How do I utilize metrics in a way that clicks the judge? And how can I allocate time to weighing as a second speaker? Like just how do I divvy up my time? So the first thing that I want to answer here is making the right call for metrics. I think the way that you can best choose metrics as a second speaker is looking at the conclusion of the arguments that have already come out from the first speakers. So what benefits and impacts are you stressing and are they stressing? Like, what is the bottom line? What is the impact? Are they trying to win on, let's say a utilitarian metric or a principal metric and trying to figure out how exactly you can prove why your metric is better than the other one? I often think that weighing metrics are directly embedded into the argumentation itself. And that is just another testament to like how pervasive weighing is. Because if you make the argument like, oh, the reason why we should allow for social movements to become, let's say in the motion, this house would prefer leaderless social movements. The argument within that could be, oh, on proposition is, okay, leaderless social movements are a lot more accessible because we lack like a distinct figurehead. And that means that a lot of people from different identities, different backgrounds can, I guess, sympathize and join the movement. That inherently has a weighing metric, which is that we get more access or more accessibility. And that's why we get like a larger social movement to begin with. And I think at the very end of the day, as the second speaker, you really want to push that metric of accessibility over whatever the opposition can claim, which is to say that, okay, leaderless social movements can be really, really hard to organize. You have to weigh like, okay, lack of quality versus quantity in like its most core form and prove why having higher quantity of people within the movement is a lot better. That's just one example of, I guess, how deeply embedded weighing metrics can be within the arguments that you're making from the first speaker. I think secondly is to look at what differentiates your side from theirs. So going back to the Kendrick Drake example, you shouldn't, I guess, weigh on like a metric that both sides are doing very excellently or very poorly on. So think about how you differ in terms of whether it be like argument quality, argument impact, or round dynamic. You basically want to exploit your side differences to say that like, okay, even if they have X plus Y, we win very, very sizably on this metric, and that is round winning. So you want to exploit and extend the leads that you already have in this round, in your round, and basically like lengthen the distance between your side and their side. One thing to note within picking metrics is that you should not attempt to weigh on as many metrics as possible. That is very counterproductive and oftentimes can just lead to a lot of confusion. I would say confusion and also just like the judge probably will not buy any of them, given that you like are running yourself dry and going through them at like the speed of light. I would instead recommend to pick one or two weighing metrics and explain them very thoroughly. Just say that, okay, why, if all else fails, why this is our path to victory. Give a few sizable reasons why we should care the most about them. And that is oftentimes enough to be fairly persuasive, or at least exert sizable pressure on the opposition and therefore do like a lot of damage, I would say. I would also tell you guys that there is no one correct metric to use. Like in any case, in any argument that you want to really like argue for, that can be weighed upon multiple metrics to differing levels of success. I would say there is no one correct metric to use, only ones that are more intuitive or I guess easier to explain to the judge. So for example, like I mentioned, there's like the quality versus quantity argument as well. There's the freedom versus safety argument that often happens in like governmental debates and like leadership, democratic debates as well. So yeah, I would say don't really put it in your head that you need to get through as many metrics as possible, or you need to quickly identify the correct metric, but rather explore with different metrics and take the time to really think about and internalize why this metric should matter to the judge in the round. Okay, so continuing on with explain the metric, I would say the first thing is to just be clear in structure, if not explicitly clear in like, okay, this is XYZ. There are like 1, 2, 3 reasons why this is true. Be clear in like ideology. So your speech structure may vary, but it's good to have weighing right after your rebuttal under one large topic or question. There are like weighing questions that you can ask yourself under this topic or question that really help direct you to the right point or the right conclusion that you can use to justify this weighing metric, which is like, why is this topic more or less important? It's like very, very simple question. Why should we care more or care less about this topic? And like I said before, even if they win this question, why is it just less important than why question? Another thing to note is do not get too technical or I guess lost in explicit weighing mathematics and like linguistics. So don't outright try to say like my weighing metric is X and X beats Y because of XYZ reasons on XYZ margin. So like I think it's very easy to get lost in the sauce of weighing metrics and try to really like weigh down to the very, very like tangible and technical. I think implicit weighing is very powerful when you can just give a few lines of very powerful rhetoric, and that can be enough to really sway the judge and say like, yes, we should care about this argument. Yes, this argument probably is really, really important and should be acknowledged in this debate. So I think I said before, like we have to think about, okay, why is X metric more important than Y? But I think that you guys can experiment and really play around with the way that you want to deliver this content and deliver the weighing metrics themselves. For some, it might be better to just state them out. But I would just say, like, as a word of caution, as a judge, it can be easy to get lost if you are trying to go through like a very technical route of explaining your weighing metrics. Yeah, so this leads me to my other point, which is that when you want to explain the metric, it's very, very beneficial to draw comparisons and make a lot of thought experiments. So in really high level rounds, whether that be in BP or WSCC, picture painting is super persuasive and can convey like a very, very hard message concisely. So that's to say, like, if you want to picture paint, for example, why the metric of like long-term benefits are better than like short-term, very tangible and accessible impacts. Can talk about like, okay, like a grandparent generation, how the fact that people who haven't been born yet literally do not have consent, how they like will be living on this earth for years to come, how our lives can extend far beyond our own. Just like use a lot of picture painting to describe either the pain that certain groups are feeling or will be able to feel, or the benefits that your own case can accrue that they simply cannot get. So I guess it's like a larger point on style and improving upon style as a speaker. But I think the takeaway from this is that picture painting and like thought experiments are really, really good for proving why weighing metrics, which are inherently very subjective, right? Like, I don't know, or like, it's not really a given that utilitarianism is better than like other forms of weighing or like principles like deontology. But instead, when you use a lot of rhetoric and picture painting, that can give the judge a really good sense of why they should care on like an otherwise subjective or debatable topic. I would also recommend to try to use hypothetical numbers or statistics when discussing scale and impact. So for example, you might have heard in a lot of like recorded debate rounds, having like one person in terrible conditions, like I said earlier, versus like 100 in slightly lower conditions. This is like a type of weighing that uses numerics in like an obviously hypothetical manner, but in a way that really illustrates clearly what exactly is your benefit and what exactly like are you trying to win on? Is it scale? Is it scope? Is it magnitude? Things like that. I think another thing that could also be helpful for weighing metrics and explaining them is just reading more philosophy. I know that might not be the most exciting pastime for you guys, or maybe it is, who knows, like that could be one of your hobbies. I would say to read upon like existing philosophy novels, like philosophy texts, explaining why we should care about things like, okay, the poor, or why we should care. Maybe that's not the best example, but why we should care about the poor. But you get what I mean in the sense that like there are deeper philosophical topics that we want to fall back upon, that can be explained through philosophy. For example, like risk management, whether or not we should care about longevity, like AI and consent. All of these things I think can really tie back into the debate in otherwise very abstract concepts. And I would suggest like doing a good browse on the insight, like philosophy, encyclopedia websites and things like that. It could potentially be helpful. Yeah. So I think another thing to consider when choosing metrics, this is like going back to the larger, guess, strategic outlook that you should have as a second speaker. One is just under the question of like, how much time should I allocate to weighing at all? Um, the unsatisfactory but true answer of this is that it's heavily round dependent, and there really is no formula to calculate like you should be doing 1 minute of weighing metrics, or oh, if they respond to X, Y, and Z point, it should be 2 minutes. It's really very hard to measure. It's round dependent, but I would say like when you're trying to choose like whether or not you should weigh very extensively what metric, like how long you should spend on this metric, be cognizant of firstly, how broad is the context of this debate? That is to say, are the arguments that have already arisen in this debate all of the arguments that like we're probably going to have? Like, is this debate very narrow in terms of argumentation? And the reason why you want to think about this is if you are weighing with existing arguments and the opposition team brings up a new argument that could be like disastrous for you guys, and like it's completely new, it doesn't fall within the existing metric, or like introduces a new stakeholder, a new metric itself, that probably is bad news for you guys, because that means that you spent like a good amount of time weighing on something that ultimately doesn't matter, or is just struck in, like taken down by the other opposition side. So be cognizant of like, okay, if there are just two large arguments in this debate, I would say go ham on weighing metrics earlier on, because you know that that's what the debate is going to boil down to, just the quality of weighing between two large points. And that leads me to my second point, which is how well proven are your existing arguments? And that is to say, like, I know we've been talking a lot about weighing metrics as a second speaker, but ultimately a second speaker is supposed to reinforce and kind of like buttress what already has been said by the first. So if the first speaker had tons of holes in their arguments, if the arguments have been like damaged and like, I guess, like rummaged through by the opposition, you need to do a lot of existing groundwork to just build back your argumentation. And weighing metrics should be placed on the back burner. So I would say weighing should be carefully placed as a second speaker. I don't think you should spend, like as a general rule of thumb, more than 2 minutes, unless the debate is very, very clear already. And like, you know that you're going to be weighing on these two things ultimately at the very end of the day. You should weigh preemptively for around 2 minutes maximum. But like I said, take this with a grain of salt. It is heavily round dependent, and you need to really consider how well proven are your existing arguments? What else do I need to be doing as a second speaker? Are those more important? Because ultimately you can still get your whip speaker to do a lot of the weighing and heavy lifting there. Other things to note as a second speaker, or like within weighing metrics, is to acknowledge deadlocks if necessary. Like I said before, weighing metrics are a really good way of breaking deadlocks by explaining why, even if you cannot really prove conclusively which side is right on XY topic, you can use a different weighing metric to say, like, even if we're not right, or like we're not completely right on this topic, why on other things we are definitely right, and why that should be viewed as the round, or like the deal breaker for this round. And that can also be like a good way of like telling the judge, hey, I'm aware that this round is quite messy. I'm aware that like we're not really winning on the things that we are saying that we're winning on, but rather like, okay, we have this deadlock, but rather we have like a winning metric, and that's very, very good. And you should pay attention to that. Yeah. So besides that, I also think that you should consider as a second speaker, predicting whip speaker progression. Like, what can they touch on? what is the opposition going to push? Like I said before, it's kind of, I guess, unideal if you spend a lot of time weighing on a metric that is ultimately scrapped or just beaten by a new argument by the opposition. You want to think about what their whip or what their deputy is going to say and weigh cautiously in a way that the whip can, like, your future whip or the whip that your side's whip can go off of. So like I said, like, whips can still do a lot of weighing. That's pretty much their job. Don't go too crazy and like take up a lot of complex level, like high level weighing mechanisms or like weighing metrics when you still have the whip speaker going after you. Okay. So this is one tip that I think I've noticed recently, like over the past few, I guess, months of me debating, is that weighing as a second speaker is intrinsically tied to direct rebuttal. So weighing arguments is often focused on likelihood weighing as a second speaker, and then consequentialist weighting, which is basically to say, like, okay, did the opposition prove this arg sufficiently? Is this mechanism completely true? That is likelihood weighing, which is just comparing, okay, which side has a higher likelihood of actually achieving their argument or like proving why their argument is right. I think the inherent action of disproving mechanisms is very, very like weighing, is very, very correlated to weighing, because you can minimize opposition impacts and strengthen your own weighing by saying, like, okay, if their side lacks, the actual true brunt of the impacts that they're claiming, then we actually can win on their own mechanisms. So just bringing back direct rebuttal or tying in your weighing to direct rebuttal is very, very strategic. And I would say is like an art that needs to be practiced, but oftentimes should come almost naturally or fall into place. So when you're giving your rebuttal, talk about, okay, what is the implication of this argument being less true, of this argument having, very diluted impacts, and then you can do weighing there as well. Yeah. So consequentialist impacts, even if the argument mechanisms are true and impacts are actually accessed, why is it still worse? We've gone over this. This is just what the second speaker is largely going to be spending their time weighing on. All right. So I think I've done quite like a lengthy description of how exactly weighing is important and ways that you can approach it as a second speaker. These are just further resources that I found helpful into the kind of improving in the very, very fickle art of weighing metrics. Just two things. Firstly is observation, and second is practice. I think whipping and BP debating are both very helpful in terms of, I guess, honing your weighing metric skills, because they force you to gain round awareness and become less content dependent. This is especially the case in BP, because like I said, BP has shorter prep time. You're not going to generate nearly as highly polished and curated content. You have less time to deliver this content. And you also have just more content from different angles, like flying at you. You have a lot of a better like chance strategically to, use different metrics to say, like, okay, even if they run X, Y, and Z argument, which you have no clue if they actually are going to, we still triumph because of like this metric. And it's just very, very helpful for building your tolerance for, trying to weigh even when you're losing mechanistically on different argumentation. I would also encourage you guys to try out different metrics. I know that there are a lot of very common ones that like I've talked about, but I would say for things like, okay, interim harm, long-term, short-term metrics, try out using these metrics, whether you're like crafting your argumentation, so during prep time, or even when you're delivering rebuttal or when you're trying to weigh as a second speaker in your own speech. I think it's very, very good to like not be afraid of using new metrics that might feel foreign to you, because there might be a round where the metric is actually perfectly like suitable to the argument that you're trying to push forward. Like maybe the weighing metric is one that you aren't as experienced with, but chances are there will be a motion that some crazy, I guess, uh core like CA team whips up, and likely like you're going to use different metrics and be like, aha, I've done this before. I have experience using this metric and explaining why this metric is important. And that's why like it's going to be helpful eventually. I would also say like experiment with different delivery methods. Like I said before, weighing metrics are very pervasive, like I said, but there are a lot of different ways that you can explain to a judge and convince them why your metric is more important than the other one. I would say experiment rhetorically, stylistically, structurally even, just to find out which one suits you the best. Okay. As for useful resources, I put 2 YouTube videos that I found very helpful in terms of, I guess, second speakers, but also weighing and strategy as a whole. One is like deputy speeches. I put the title there. You can search it up on YouTube. And second one is just whipping the debate into shape. So it's about whip speeches. But I still think that because whips do a lot of weighing, it is important to know, like, I guess, the thought process of what goes into a good whip speech and how they take into account everything that's going into the round. Yeah, both of these videos are on YouTube. Okay, so for debates with excellent weighing, I recommend watching the Macau Online WSDC 2021 semifinals, and also the round 4 of WSDC 2023, which was between Sri Lanka and Malaysia. I think they have really good examples of how you can weigh in ways that are impactful, but also like from their second speakers, not overburdening or like, I guess, excessive. And then I also linked to BP finals that I found very entertaining and also really good in terms of just their speakers and them stylistically employing their own weighing mechanisms and using that to win the round. Okay, so thank you for sitting through what was arguably a longer lecture and not really speaking during this. I was wondering if you guys have any questions. I know I got a private message from Vishali about a question. So if you guys have any, feel free to ask them right now.
Hey guys, this is a unique opportunity, especially if you want to improve your weighing and improve your second speeches. So do engage, since that's like the most optimum form to improve. So if you all do have any questions, I'm sure Sophia will be really happy to take them on.
And also, guys, if anyone doesn't feel comfortable speaking up, like if you send it in chat, that could be a way to get an answer as well. So one of those methods would be great.
Yeah, I see the raised hand.
Yeah, so if there's a situation where a certain point is in contention from both sides on a practical and a principle basis, then in that case, should you
Yeah.
weigh between those, or should you just avoid trying to wait and prove and just, yeah, I don't know. In that situation, should weighing be used?
Okay, so just to confirm your question, is this when the opposition side or one side is arguing on principle argumentation and the other side is arguing practical?
Yeah, basically.
Okay, yeah, so I think in those cases, principle and practical, I would say it's a lot easier to actually weigh and prove why the practical is more important. Just because I think, especially in rounds that I've done in high school, principles are not very well built by the teams, like, I guess, younger debaters, or I guess a lot of debaters in general. I would say that it's a lot easier to just claim tangible impacts and prove why, regardless of the principle, you have X, Y, and Z impacts. But obviously, if the principle is well built, I think it takes a lot more effort to prove why it is okay to violate this principle. Okay, to break this down, you either prove why it is okay to violate this principle in this unique circumstance because of X, Y, and Z impacts that you are giving or you're proclaiming on your side, or two, that it's not actually a violation of the principle and detailing why, using their own metrics, why it isn't. So for example, I think in a lot of rounds, the way that people really, really push forward a principle is by giving specific metrics as to what fulfills like a principal obligation, or like what fulfills, for example, a ban. So in this case, like take for example the motion, this house would ban online gambling websites. The principle that the proposition is going to bring up is what constitutes a ban, and they're going to give like 5 good reasons what justifies the government banning something. You probably, as like the other side or as opposition, will have to say like, okay, actually the 5 reasons that they give, we're not violating any of them. Like online sports gambling doesn't meet the bar to ban, and therefore dispute their own principle argument. Or two, talk about why like the other like benefits that online gambling gives outweigh or overpower the ban. So in this case, I think you can also talk about like, happiness, the principle of happiness, principle of autonomy, and how people have the right to choose what they want to do with their money. And I think I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of where this debate would progress, but proposition would likely say something like, okay, but when you're gambling, you lose all sense of autonomy because you get really addicted to gambling. You have to prove why that doesn't happen or why that's okay. So just to recap what I said, I think in debates where they're pushing forward a principle and you're pushing forward a practical, you need to engage with them on the principle front, either by saying it's not a violation of the principle or by giving your own principle and proving why your own principle is more important. And if you really can't do the first two, proving why the principle is just less important and why the benefits that you give practically are just supremely amazing. So do with that what you will. Does that make sense?
Yep, thank you.
Okay, cool. So I got two questions. The first is, do you have any specific tips for speech structure? Like, do you do areas of response, clashes, something else? Thanks. Okay, cool. So the way that I usually structured my deputy speeches is by using questions. So I would go with clarifications, and clarifications honestly are like a fancy way of you giving like smart one-liners to points that the opposition is making. And I think ultimately clarifications are supposed to be really, really short but valuable points that kind of like do a lot of damage to the opposition's case. So for example, clarification, reframing the round to like bring the debate back to the center that you're very strategically held in, and like clarification, oh, this one mechanism that they rely their case on doesn't actually work. Clarifications, from my own personal view, I like saying them just because I feel like they really give the judge a good impression of like really, really, I guess, strong rebuttal. But clarifications can also just be integrated in rebuttal. But back to the general question. So what I would do as a second speaker is firstly talk about questions, and questions would include general topics. So rebuttals would be defending question number one, like integrated within question number one. And it would often be, okay, rebutting what they've said, rebuilding our own argumentation, and then doing a conclusion within that larger question about what this means for the debate, which is also just another way of weighing. So I feel like there is no like bar by bar I can give you for deputy structures, especially because I think for me, myself, it does change depending on round dynamics. But I would say structure into large themes. Make sure that within these themes, you're doing two things. One, rebuilding your own case and making sure that the argument that you are trying to like push forward in your first speaker still stands. And secondly, making sure that you're doing a lot of rebuttal work towards their case as well. So it's like defensive and offensive within each clash. And then I would just move on to extension. But the extension would not be very long usually. So yeah, the questions would take up the majority of the time. Okay, the other question is, can you give tips on personal speeches, especially focusing on main points? Can I ask what you mean by main points, for the person who sent me the DM? Like, maybe elaborate more on what the main points you mean. Yeah, I'll wait for you to type that, but yes, raised hand.
Yeah, I would like to know if you could share an example of a debate where you had to navigate between sticking to your principles as well as adapting to practical considerations.
That's okay. Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think a lot of the times the best example I can think of is the criminal justice system, just because it integrates very, very much principle considerations, because justice is a very principally driven term. Like, what defines justice? What is the correct thing to do? What is the moral thing to do? But I think the other side of this the criminal justice system is like efficacy and really getting rehab and making sure that you lower crime rates. So for example, one debate that I could have had would be about, okay, this house would focus, this is like a very, very famous motion. I would also encourage you guys to watch this. It's also online. I think it's like the 2018 World Schools WSDC semis between England and China, and it's about having rehabilitation as the only concern within criminal justice sentencing. So in this round, I think you have to simultaneously balance proving why this is the right thing to do, principally why rehabilitation is justified in being the only consideration in debate, but also proving why you lessen criminality and like crime rates and why rehab actually leads to better outcomes in the CJS system. So I think in this case, you would try to balance both aspects, but really, I think it's sufficient for you to like win on one only. Ultimately, I think the whip in that round did both and they won on both fronts. But I would urge you to watch that round. And I think that's a very good example of a motion that would force you to kind of balance both fronts. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. So the person replied, thank you. Can you give tips on personal speeches, especially focusing on main points, main arguments of the debate? Okay, this is a very, very broad question, but I think for me, when I am kind of overwhelmed with a lot of moving pieces in the debate, and like as a second speaker, I'm trying to just get through my speech and make sure that the arguments that we have are still left standing, but also, I guess, strengthened and reaffirmed, is hi. Hi. Jaden? Okay. Moving on. Where was I? Yes, okay. So, all right. That's okay, so the person specified their point even further by saying that, okay, as a second speaker, you need to do both rebuttal and the speech. So when is the right time to point out the main arguments? I think to rephrase your question, when exactly do you rebuild as a second speaker? That's a very good question. I think, honestly, for me, rebuilding would happen within the clashes. So when I'm discussing larger questions, I would do rebuttal first because I'm like a very excited second speaker. I like rebutting first. I'd do rebuttal first, then I'd rebuild our own case and then give weighing and then summarize what the importance of the clash is. But like I said, I think it's very, very subjective. And honestly, when is the right time to point out the main arguments is very, very much up to you and your own analysis of the round, which is to say that, okay, like, did they actually damage our main arguments? Do I need to rebuild our main arguments? How much time do I have to allocate to that? Because if you are just simply trying to repeat arguments or make sure that the arguments do not get lost in the judge's head and like really reinforce that we said X points, they didn't respond to this at all. That's not going to take too long if they didn't respond to it. But if you are trying to rebuild to like significant damage being done to your argumentation, that is going to take significantly longer time. You should probably allocate that like explicitly within your clashes and tell judges like responding to their points on our argument and like points XYZ. This is not true because of XYZ reasons, and going through that list and making sure that the argument still stands as well. Hopefully that answers your question. I think just in summary, it is very subjective. It is dependent on the round, much like weighing metrics, but I would urge you to prioritize rebuttal and then after rebuttal go into rebuilding because I think they often go hand in hand. Okay, I think Rashid raised their hand. So Rashid, you want to ask your question?
If the other team has a lot of moving parts and they're trying to prove a lot of things at once, what do you feel is the best way to choose, like what is most important to weigh upon?
Yeah, okay, good question. I would just say, look at it from the judge's perspective. The judge is also going to be hella overwhelmed by just the sheer amount of material coming at them. And the chances are, if they're spewing out a lot of arguments going out in all different directions, they're not going to be very well mechanized. I would say, firstly, point out which points that they're saying make the most sense. Like which ones out of all of them are the most well proven. Use those and target those. But I would also say, if you're coming up as the second speaker and like they have a lot of material, filter out, okay, what is probably the most relevant to this case? And you can do that by which ones they proved the best. And just to make sure that like to the words, the judge's perspective, you're not leaving out points on purpose. Like you're not like ignoring their points. Just run through like a quick bullet point of what they said. Like you don't have to touch on every single point because that's just not, I don't think that's feasible. Touch on like the main big points that they wanted to like go about and give a few lines. I think it should be sufficient even if you use a few, proving why their arguments just don't stand. So I would say structure it like this. Firstly, doing a bit of recap and like meta-analysis, saying like, okay, opposition came up, they spent a lot of time on a lot of different points, none of them very well proven, but we're gonna take them at their best case and like choose 2 of their points that make the most sense. Rebut those accordingly and explain why the remaining few points just aren't well mechanized enough, do not flow like mechanistically, or just fall out of the scope of this debate. And I wouldn't stress too much about those arguments unless they're well proven, because like you won't need to spend too much time on disproving poorly made arguments. That's not going to be too much of a time sucker. So just to recap, choose 1 or 2 points that make the most sense, rebut to them fairly, I would say charitably, because the judge likely isn't going to buy them completely if they're not that well built. But if they are, respond to them charitably. Then use the rest of the argumentation, like explain why they're just not important. Use weighing metrics, I guess, or also you can just directly rebut them. And I think that should be sufficient. So pick your own battles. Don't try to go through every single point mechanistically and give like 3 lines of rebuttal to every single thing. Prioritize. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Got another message. How can you direct the thinking of the opposite team if they're going through a theoretical way to a practical way when their methods on the debate seem off? As a first speaker. Okay, so the way that I'm interpreting your question is, what if the opposition team is honing a lot or putting a lot of time into stressing one argument or one metric? How can we direct the opposition team into going like going into another metric or going into the thinking of your own team? Hopefully that's right, and hopefully I like internalize that right. Okay, so I think the importance with this is if the opposition team stresses one metric a lot, that is actually, I guess, a weakness. That is both a strength and a weakness. Because if the metric is very, very like, I guess, clear, and like they have only one metric that they're winning on, you can easily introduce 2 or 3 and explain why that metric is just not as important anymore. So that is to say, if they have a very, very strong advantage, for example, in like solving climate change, I would say, firstly, you have to like address that metric, like I said, either by mitigating, either by like proving why you still can like win on their metrics, and then going into another metric and by explaining like, okay, that metric is not nearly as important as the one that we're about to bring to you, which is metric X, Y, and Z, which is making sure that the world's economy is still functioning. Which is, I think, like a very, very common clash, which is if we focus too much on, environmentalism, then these economies of XYZ nations are just going to fall apart. So like I said, just to draw that into a conclusion, if they focus too much on winning on climate change, and the debate is not just about climate change, it's about like carbon tax, and that can be like anything. You can say, sure, climate change is important. We recognize that we do have to solve it, but this incurs another terrible, terrible thing that they refuse, like that they just completely miss out on, and invokes like XYZ damages and makes them lose on this metric. So I would just want to recap everything that I'm saying, just to make sure that it's very clear. Stressing one metric is not a good thing. I would say if they do that on your side. Like you can easily just refocus the debate into like another lens and prove to the judge why that metric is not as important. Like, but I always want to like repeat that you still have to find a way to acknowledge their metric. You cannot just completely say like, okay, there's this metric, we have another metric, our metric is better. I would say like that's one step, but you also have to prove why their metric, like you can still fulfill that, or you can still meet that to a certain extent and therefore weaken how much they win. So you cannot just like allow it to be two completely different metrics that you guys both lose humongously on, because then the judge will have no way to like balance that. So you have to try to mitigate their metric while also providing a new one. That makes sense. Okay, Vishali, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, I don't think so, but go ahead.
You are pronouncing that correctly, surprisingly. Anyways,
Thank you.
if I was positioned as second speaker in a debate and it was my turn, would it be more advantageous to rebut first or to start my argument first?
Okay. Personal preference, I would say most second speakers would agree with me, but I would easily say rebuttal. Honestly, like I said before, kind of the extensions that you're given as a second speaker are oftentimes like leftovers, not to say it in like a very uncouth way, but usually the extension is not going to be too groundbreaking. Unless it is, then you can definitely start with that if you feel like you won't have time to get to it and you have like poor time management. Start with that argument, it's totally fine. As for me, I think the most fun part and most important part about second speeches is definitely just the rebuttal work and making sure that you're rebutting to the points that need to be rebutted so that the opposition doesn't get too far ahead of you and you still have like a comparative advantage, if you know what I mean. So just to answer your question, I would put rebuttals first, but it really depends. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Comments. Would you say that rebutting your opponent's arguments is more important than bringing in new arguments during your speech? I think I answered this just now when I was replying. I would say it is round dependent once again. That is the sad part about second speeches. They're very flexible and responded to whatever's going on in the round. But in most cases, rebutting opponents' arguments will be much more important than bringing in new arguments during your speech. Unless the opponent's arguments are just not that well built and not that important, which is probably unlikely given that, you know, you're going to face some really good opponents during your time, during your tournament, like I guess run. Rebutting is just, I would say, a lot more important as a second speaker. And bringing in new arguments, I would say the rebuttals that you give are almost like new arguments. They're like almost just as momentous because they make sure that your case doesn't lose its footing. I think bringing in new arguments is good and can be strategic sometimes, but there have been times where I think I have brought in new extensions that have like been a complete 180 from what we've run in our first speaker. And the judge was like, it felt really, you know, incohesive and I kind of got lost. So I would say like it's better to maintain consistency, have a clear team line down the bench about your path to victory. And the way that you can protect this team line is through rebuttal. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question. Is there a way to rebut weighing? Sorry, did someone say? Okay. Back to the question. Is there a way to rebut weighing? Yeah, I think there is, but I think it gets really subjective because at the very end of the day, like there is no right answer to different weighing metrics. Like short term versus long term, which one is better? There's no conclusive and objective answer. So I would say the way to rebut weighing is just really bad like answer, but it's just being more persuasive. Like you just gotta drive your point forward about like, okay, these people are really in need of this, and really like drawing the judge in, using rhetoric, proving why like we have an obligation, and just contrasting this metric with another metric or like another weighing mechanism that the other team used, and just saying like belittling them. So the way to rebut weighing is drawing differences and then impacting those differences, if that makes sense. Like you can't really say that their weighing is wrong. You can say that their weighing is not as important, or their weighing is actually not based on like their argumentation. Like they don't actually access their weighing because they don't have the right mechanisms. So going back to what I said in my presentation, you need to prove two things to do correct weighing. One, that your argument actually links to the right metrics. Two, that your metric is the important metric to judge the round on. You can dispute someone's weighing based on those two fronts. So either saying like, actually, your argument doesn't succeed on the utilitarian weighing that you want to even claim in the first place because your mechanisms don't work. Or your metric just does not work because it's less important. And I'm going to explain to you why using a lot of like thought experiments and like principle heavy language, things like that. Yeah, so those two fronts, I would say those are the ways to rebut weighing, or at least take down a weighing metric. Yeah, hopefully that helps. But yeah, that's a very hard thing to do. So yeah, definitely needs practice. All right. Are there any more questions? Okay. If not, thank you guys for listening to this presentation and for asking questions. I think y'all got more engaged towards the end. And thanks, General, for having me. I hope that this was helpful, and you can always find me for more questions later. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Sophia, from the Debaters Council and me. I think the session was super interesting, and thank you so much for staying like 20 minutes for like a Q&A that I think a lot of people found like super helpful. And yeah, have a great rest of summer. And yeah, and thanks everyone for coming for workshop 3. We'll see you all again, hopefully, for workshop 4. Tell your friends. And yeah, have a good night, everyone.